Hey guys, welcome to Crater Mania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to welcome you all back to the 500 Movies in 2025 series. And this is it, folks. This is the last episode. So I've done it. I watched all 500 movies that I set out to watch this year. There was a lot of bumps in the road, throughout the year that that kind of scared me. I thought I wasn't going to be able to do it by the end of the year. But like I said at one point earlier in the year here on the channel, if you set your mind to something and you stay focused, then you can absolutely do it. And like this is something I had wanted to do for a long, long time now. Not only just having my own YouTube channel, but just to watch 500 movies in one calendar year. And I started this journey back on January 1st of this year, and here I am ending with the last episode of the 500 movies in 2025 here on the last day of 2025 on December 31st, New Year's Eve. So thank you all for joining me on this journey. For all those of you who have just kind of watched these videos, whether if you watched all of them or you just watched some of them, thank you so much for just even taking time out of your day to hear me talk about these movies. Some of them that I've loved for many years, and a lot of them that I've watched for the first time this year. Um, I'll talk a little bit more at the end of this episode of what the future of the channel is going to be like, what, I got in store for that. So yeah, we'll talk about that more, but just, yeah, again, before I get into the movies, the last five movies of the 500 movies in 2025, again, just thank you guys so much for everybody out there that has come in and listen to me talk about these movies, or whether you're just listening to them or you've been in the chat saying stuff about these movies, or just anybody out there that's just supported me along the way. Thank you guys so much. I really really appreciate it. um but I had originally planned to have this stream at 6 p.m. Eastern time tonight, but I moved it up a little bit. So if you're in here, thank you for being in here at this time that I moved it up to at 4:30, because just I got a lot of stuff going on tonight, and I see that Mr. Fanboy J says, "Hey, they're doing anything for New Year's? Just chilling." That's what I was just about to get into. So that's why I moved the stream up to 4:30, because not only do we have our little New Year's Eve party here at the house going, we're going to have all kinds of good stuff to eat, some little maybe some games and stuff, and then at 8 o'clock tonight is the Stranger Things series finale. I got my Stranger Things shirt on right now. I'm ready for this finale. This is one of my favorite shows of all time, and maybe that's something I'll do later on down the road on the channel, is kind of like talk about some different Stranger Things stuff, even though the show will be over with by then. And this is it. This is the end of the series. After 10 years, this show has just provided me so much joy and entertainment, and just really a lot of emotional moments within this show. It's just something that has really kind of I've touched on a personal level with. And I know a lot of people out there was like, "Oh, it's overrated," or "It's not very good," or "This last season kind of sucks." I disagree with all that. I think that this last season so far has been fantastic. Um, there's a lot of like loose ends that they tied up, especially in that last episode. And I know that people are going on IMDb and places like that, Rotten Tomatoes, and review bombing this last episode. But to me, that's got to be one of my favorite episodes in the entire series, because there's a lot of different moments within that. I think a lot of people are just kind of like focusing on one particular moment, and is why saying it was unnecessary, which was with spoiler alert, it was Will's coming out party basically, where he just but I felt like we if you're been a fan of Stranger Things for a while now, I think a lot of us saw that coming, and I think it needed to happen. I think it was a very important part that needed to be, talked about on the show, because in that scene alone, you know, I just feel like there was a lot of things surrounding that was more than just Will coming out as gay, but it really, just kinda inspires other people as well besides the gay community. I think it's something that inspires people to to face your fears, to do things that you put your mind to. Don't be afraid of, you know, of letting people know how you really feel about stuff. So, I mean, it just it c so that whole speech can be inspiring and apply to anyone out there, and I thought it was a beautiful scene. I thought it was, beautifully acted by Noah Schnapp. He did amazing in that whole scene. Just like that kid is such a really good actor. Um, and I think he's been one of the best actors on this entire series, and I'm super excited for tonight to see how this all plays out, how everything, you know, just kind of brings to this kind of conclusive end to the show. I'm scared too, and also just it's kind of depressing in a way because, like I said, this is one of my favorite shows of all time, and it's gonna be over after this, they've talked about spin-offs, stuff, but it's just I feel like it's not gonna be the same. I mean, this cast of these characters on this show are some of the best characters that I've ever fell in love with on a TV show, and, I'm really, really gonna miss seeing these characters, not getting to see them anymore. It's gonna suck, really, but again, at the same time, super excited for tonight, can't wait for that. So, I just wanted to talk about that a little bit, what's going on with me, and New Year's and stuff this year. I hope everyone out there watching, is going to have a really good new year. I hope you guys, maybe made some resolutions, make some changes in your life. Maybe you want to set goals like I did. I set a goal for myself at the end of last year with this 500 movies in 2025, and I accomplished that. And I hope you guys can, come up with your own things too. Um, if somebody out there wants to try to watch 500 movies and document it like I did here on a YouTube channel, that'd be awesome. I would let me know. I'll definitely watch that. I'll watch your stuff. Um, but yeah, I mean, just I hope you guys have a great new year. But I'm gonna go ahead and get started with tonight's episode, which will be the very last episode, as I said, of the 500 movies in 2025. So hope you guys enjoy it. And I want to start off with this movie. As I always say, this is movies 496 through 500. So we've done it, folks. And with this first movie, and I'm a huge horror fan. I'm a huge slasher fan. So of course I had to throw this one in there, as my last bunch of movies I'm going to talk about at the end of the year. And so for dedicated fans to the slasher genre, the early 1980s represents this golden age, or at least, very least, just a kind of fascinatingly, just a fascinating period in the time of horror. It was defined by the post like Halloween boom, that started in 1978, and amid the whole like glut of mass killers and final girls, this movie, New Year's Evil, which came out in 1980, it stands out, not as a masterpiece or anything, or nor does it's not a complete misfire either. Um, but it just kind of stands out as this very curious, atmospheric oddity that just captures both, the stylistic trends and just the story limitations, of its era. And it was directed and co-written by Emmett Alston. Um, and the film blends this new wave aesthetic with these slasher themes, attempt to kind of ride that wave of, punk infused counterculture, while adhering to, that familiar structure of, of a killer on a clock. Um, the the result is this movie that is far from flawless, yet it's undeniably intriguing, for its ambition and unique tone, I think. So at its core, New Year's Evil is this time zone based slasher, with this with a gimmick, a killer, which name is Evil, calls this live late night TV and radio broadcast that's hosted by um, this DJ Diane Sullivan, known on air as Blaze, and pledge to commit one murder at the stroke of midnight in each U.S. time zone. And that culminates in Blaze herself as the final victim in the Pacific zone. So the film opens on this kind of glitzy Los Angeles night with strobe lights and colored hair and this energetic soundtrack that firmly embeds it in the late 70s, early 80s post punk scene. Um, and Blaze's show is this celebration of youth and rebellion, and this kind of thematic contrast to this lurking menace that will soon disrupt this party. And the killer is this disembodied voice, with this distorted tone. Excuse me. Taunts the radio station with these cassette recordings of his victims' final moments, screams and struggles and just chilling silence. And these audio cues are one of the film's more effective and unsettling choices. Um, and unlike many slashers that are reliant on visual shock, New Year's Evil I think leverages sound to build that dread. We hear the Eastern Time Zone murder before we see it, and the delayed reveal adds this layer of tension rarely found in lower budget horror outings, I think. But as the body count slowly rises, first this nurse, then these excuse me, these two young women, near a liquor store, then a biker at this drive-in. The investigation grapples with this threat, and the killer's presence is left, or it's left unseen. I guess I should say it's more felt than seen. Um, and when he finally appears, he's clad in this black costume, this mask. I think it's like a um, Laurel and Hardy mask or something. But the film takes this turn into this more kind of conventional slasher territory. Um, and the climax unfolds at the hotel where the broadcast is taking place, and in this kind of twist, it's aiming for emotional weight rather than shock value. The murderer is revealed to be Blaze's own husband, Richard, who just snaps under the pressure of perceived rejection, not just from his wife, but from women in general. And his rant about hating women really adds this layer of just disturbing misogyny and just aligning with that whole era's recurring slasher theme of like male resentment. Um, and the finale of the movie, it's just this confrontation on a rooftop. And this malfunctioning elevator, and these police are firing their guns all over the place, and just and there's this suicide leap from Richard is just it's completely staged, but it lacks that visceral impact of these genre standouts. However, the post credit sting is where New Year's Evil truly distinguishes itself, I think. And Blaze, she's injured and seemingly safe and is placed into this ambulance, only to realize too late that the driver is her son, Derek. Um, and, wearing his father's mask and silently steering into the night. So with the ambiguous ending, underscored by a radio announcer calling in the midnight strike in Hawaii, is one of the film's strongest moments. It's haunting, it's unresolved, and in keeping with that nihilistic undercurrent, of early '80s horror. But upon release, New Year's Evil, it received little critical attention, and it performed modestly at the box office. It was overshadowed by the likes of Friday the 13th, the Prom Night, and The Fog. There's a lot of horror movies that came out in 1980. Um, and but using Friday the 13th and Prom Night as examples, both of these which had these bigger budgets and broader appeal. And over time, however, the film has accrued this cult following. Particularly among genre enthusiasts who appreciate its kind of moody atmosphere and the retro soundtrack. It has a lot of good music in it. I gotta admit, and it just has this very unique setting and premise. But its legacy lies not in innovation, but in its whole niche appeal. Um, while it's not the first slasher to use this kind of media centric motif, Terror Train and The Prowler were released the same year. Experimented with public performance and live events, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute because I'm going to be talking about Terror Train after this. But New Year's Evil remains one of the few to so directly integrate broadcast culture, into its story. Um, just the idea of a killer using these airwaves as a you know uh, stage for terror. That foreshadows later themes in films like Scream and Unfriended. So I don't know if you ever seen that. It's a movie that was really neat, kind of like uh, all these kids are in a Zoom meeting, and but they're kind of being haunted. I don't want to go too much into it, but like because I'm afraid I'll give something away with it. But that movie came out in 2014. If you haven't seen that one, it's a very good movie, in my opinion, at least. But it's kind of with New Year's Evil, it's like I said, it foreshadowed later things in films like that, but in this far simpler kind of analog form because this was 1980. I mean, but moreover, I mean, the film's kind of feminist subtext or lack thereof, I guess you should say, is a point of debate here. While Blaze is this strong, independent woman in this kind of male dominated industry, her agency is ultimately undermined by the story's focus on her relationship with her abusive husband and just the implication that her career success is the root of his madness. um Yet the final twist, reframes the story as this cycle of trauma and like inherited violence, with her son, taking up the mantle of madness, in the post credit scene. This this complexity kind of gives the film more depth than many of its contemporaries, even if it doesn't fully explore, its own implications. Um, but, in conclusion, New Year's Evil is not like what you would call a landmark slasher. Um, it lacks that tight pacing of say Halloween or the shock value of Friday the 13th or even like that psychological depth of a movie like say Dress to Kill. It's technical elements, the editing, the cinematography, and some performances are competent but unremarkable. Yet as a slasher fan, one can appreciate its atmosphere. Its commitment to this kind of unique gimmick, um, and just its willingness to end on a bleak, morally ambiguous note. It's a film that kind of reveals in its own time period. The music, the fashion, the analog technology, all of which contribute to this nostalgic, almost dreamlike quality. Um, for what it is, New Year's Evil, I think, is effective. Not it's not a classic. It's not a trash classic, but this kind of curious footnote, in slasher history. Um, it earns its place not by perfection, but by persistence. And it's definitely a movie that's going to be lingering in your mind, long after you've watched it because. Um, it's kind of it's I mean, despite what you feel about it, it's kind of unforgettable. So I do recommend. It's not for everyone, but I do recommend everyone, checking New Year's Evil out at some point. And I do want to apologize, guys, if I'm like coughing and sniffling around. I've been fighting a cold for the past couple of days, and I rarely ever get sick. And this would have to happen like right on the last day of the year, when I got all this stuff going on. I had to go get ready for get our party ready, our food and stuff ready. I was working on this episode for you guys, um, preparing for the Stranger Things finale tonight. And of course I have to get sick, but I'm fighting through it. Like I said, I could have postponed this, but I wanted to do this before the year was out. Even though I've watched all the movies already in 2025, I still wanted to get this last episode to you guys here on the last day of the year. Um, and so just forgive me if you don't mind, because like I said, I am fighting through this cold, and it really sucks. It really sucks having to, because my throat hurts and like my body aches all over. Like, I don't know what's going on with me. I think there's something going around right now here in our area, and then it sucks. So hope you guys, if you anybody out there watching is sick right now, hope you're fighting it, your sickness better than what I am right now. But like I said, I'm gonna push right on through this, and just get this out here there for you guys, because like I said, I appreciate everyone that has supported me in this journey, and it really means a lot to me. But let's move on to the next movie here. So we got done talking about one slasher. Let's move on to another slasher. And as I said before, and I've said many times, I'm a lifelong fan of the slasher genre, and just also, I'm a huge fan of Jamie Lee Curtis. I've covered several of Jamie Lee Curtis's movies here on the channel this year, from The Fog and Halloween, Halloween 2, H2O, Halloween Resurrection, Mother's Boys, True Lies. Just to name a few. And I've got a couple more on this episode alone. So starting with Terror Train, and Terror Train, from which came out in 1980 as well. It's from that golden age, like I spoke of before, of the early 80s horror and slashers, and that holds a very sacred place in my heart, and just you know amid the wave of all the imitators that flood cinemas following the monumental success of Halloween in 1978, certain films have managed to kind of carve out their own unique identity. They weren't just cash ins; they were creative, atmospheric, and genuinely unsettling additions to that type of universe. And Roger Spottiswood's Terror Train is one of those such films, in my opinion. But because it's often overshadowed by its peers, like Friday the 13th and Prom Night. Terror Train is brilliantly conceived. It's expertly paced and just surprisingly, elegant slice of horror that deserves far more praise than it typically receives. It's not just a good slasher movie. It's to me, it's a masterclass in that kind of claustrophobic suspense, and that it's a very pivotal entry, in that filmography of Jamie Lee Curtis. Um, so Terror Train, is a slasher film that just takes a beautifully simple, high concept premise and executes it with just remarkable skill. The story is this classic tale of revenge. 3 years after this cruel fraternity prank leaves, a young pledge, Kenny Hampson, I think his last name was, but Kenny was psychologically shattered, and he was institutionalized, and the perpetrators, that these kids that put together this prank, they, like I said, 3 years later, they gather for this New Year's Eve costume party aboard this vintage excursion train. Um, and the setting is immediately fantastic. You have this long, narrow, moving metal coffin, basically, just and it's isolated in this frozen Canadian wilderness, and it's just filled with these obnoxious drunk college students who are just perfect candidates for victims. Um, excuse me. And the film's greatest strength, lies in its central gimmick. The killer who is seeking vengeance doesn't just stalk his victims. He utilizes the party's kind of defining feature, and and that's the costumes. He uses that to his advantage. And after each murder, he dons the victim's disguise, allowed him to kind of move undetected. Um, Knowing that, like, so he's not just killing all these people within one costume. He's moving from costume to costume. And I think that's a genius. That's a very brilliant premise. This isn't like a very hulking, mistakable figure like Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees. This is like this guy's like a chameleon, or a phantom whose identity is constantly shifting. And this very very clever device transforms every character into a potential threat. That person in the Groucho Marx mask could be the class clown, or it could be the killer. um the figure in the lizard costume could be, could just be another regular guy, or it again could be the killer. This whole premise really creates a very um paranoid dread that is far more psychologically engaging than just mere stalk and slash. And that's why I love Terror Train. And the casting is a fascinating time capsule of its era. At the helm is a young Jamie Lee Curtis. Fresh off of Halloween and The Fog, and just before prom night would hit theaters. So I mean, she did the Fog, Prom Night, and Terror Train all in the same year, 1980, and that's crazy. But in this, she plays Alana Maxwell, who was the reluctant participant in the original prank that they played on Kenny, and Jamie Lee Curtis delivers this performance that is really the whole emotional anchor of the film. She isn't just that final girl, stereotype or whatever. She is this character who is consumed by guilt and dread, long before these bodies have start dropping on this train. And her fear feels authentic in this. Her vulnerability is very palpable, and just her resilience is very believable all throughout the film. She carries the film's kind of moral weight, representing the one sliver of remorse in this group of these friends that otherwise defined by callousness. um but the supporting cast is equally strong. Featuring a pretty diehard Hart Bachner as this kind of smarmy ringleader, Doc, and then you have the ever dependable Ben Johnson, as this tough, no nonsense train conductor, Carn, I forget how you say his name, but and Ben Johnson brings this kind of world weariness that grounds the film's more outlandish elements. And then there's the legendary and bizarre casting of legendary illusionist David Copperfield, as the magician. And his performance in this is oddly effective. His kind of cold, detached stage persona and just his actual kind of sleight of hand tricks really lends the film this very eerie, uncanny quality that just perfectly complements the killer's own use of illusion and disguise. So I think that's always been so intriguing. But the director here, Roger Spottiswoode, who we've covered a couple of his movies earlier in the year on the channel, such as Stopping My Mama Shoot and The Sixth Day. But this was his feature debut. Terror Train was the very first movie that he had directed, and he just demonstrates this very confident command of atmosphere in this film. The cinematography was done by John Alcott, who was a a frequent Stanley Kubrick collaborator, known for The Shining and Barry Lyndon, and just the cinematography is gorgeous. Just in the trains interiors are just drenched in these kind of moody blues and shadows, while the steam and the cold breath of the actors just enhance that kind of frigid, isolating atmosphere. Um, the kills are effective, but by today's standards, relatively tame. Focusing more on tension and implication than that kind of gratuitous gore. Um, and the film builds, it scares through its setting, just the clatter of the tracks, the endless rows of these identical compartments, the confined spaces, just really makes the environment itself a character and a weapon. Um, but while Terror Train was considered a box office disappointment for 20th Century Fox upon its release, which made it a victim of the very slasher oversaturation it sought to kind of rise above. Its legacy has only grown brighter, I think, with time. It has rightly earned its status as a cult classic now. It's revered by many horror fans for its unique premise and kind of sustained atmosphere. Um, its impact can be seen in several key areas. Just the whole isolated vehicle subgenre. Terror Train perfected the horror in a confined moving space theme. It paved the way for countless other films set on planes and buses and ships and of course more trains. It demonstrated that suspense could be amplified exponentially when there is literally nowhere to run. It also had the whole killer in plain sight thing. While it was not the first to do it, Terror Train utilized this idea of a killer, masking his identity with the clothes, of his victims to this brilliant effect. And this concept would be, echoed and expanded upon in later films, most notably, I think, in The Thing. Um, and where, the paranoia of who is the imposter, who is the thing, is kind of pushed to this terrifying extreme. And if you guys want to know my thoughts on The Thing, which is my favorite John Carpenter film, you can go watch my last video, John Carpenter Christmas, where I talk about The Thing and many other John Carpenter films. But Terror Train also elevated the slasher formula, I feel, because in this kind of sea of, camp counselors and babysitters, um, Terror Train stood out for its more mature tone and kind of stylish, execution. It proved that a slasher film could be more than just a body count movie. It could be a genuinely well crafted thriller with a strong sense of style and competent acting and and just thematic depth. Just exploring ideas of guilt and revenge and fractured identity. um, I think it's a very brilliant film, and one of Jamie Lee Curtis's earliest films. For fans of of Jamie Lee Curtis, Terror Train is an essential chapter in her whole Scream Queen trilogy. Alongside Halloween and Prom Night, and it showcases her ability to elevate genre material and solidify that final girl, as a resilient and intelligent and emotionally complex heroine, and which is I think is a template that would define that entire genre for decades. Um, and the film's enduring appeal was confirmed, with that release of a remake in 2022 and then a direct sequel. Um, Later that same year, and it introduced this kind of new generation to this chilling concept. And the original Terror Train, though, is to me is a hidden gem of 1980s horror. It's a film that understands its the it understands the genre's mechanics, but it isn't content to simply replicate them. And by marrying a clever, suspenseful premise with, this uniquely claustrophobic setting, a magnetic lead performance from, the genre's greatest heroine at that time, and just a palpable frostbitten atmosphere. It really creates this experience that's both thrilling and intelligent. It's a slower burn than some of its more kind of famous contemporaries, but its payoff is a masterfully, sustained mood of paranoia and dread. And for slasher fans, it's an absolutely essential watch. It's a first class ticket to this thrilling, chilling, and brilliantly executed ride that has deservedly, stood the test of time. So if you've never seen Terror Train, I highly, highly recommend it. I think it's for free right now on Tubi. Um, but also suggest picking up some of the physical media releases of it as well. Terror Train was actually one of Scream Factory's first ever Blu-ray horror Blu-ray releases back in the day when they started Scream Factory. The kind of subversion of Shout Factory. So that's really cool. And a good friend of mine, Nathan Thomas Milliner, actually did the artwork for that release, amongst several other releases from Scream Factory. So really cool. Like I remember getting that when it came out, like when they released it. If you did the pre-order, you got like a poster with it. So it was just the same artwork on the cover of the Blu-ray, and you know it's just such a good movie, guys. Especially if you're a slasher fan, if you've never seen Terror Train, get on that ASAP and watch it. It's not only one of the greatest slashers, it's one of Jamie Lee Curtis's best roles, in my opinion. Um, but from moving from one Jamie Lee Curtis movie to another, but this next film is not a horror movie, but it does have Jamie Lee Curtis, and in the world of great American comedies, there are few films that kind of possess that perfect storm of talent and timing and just that social satire, as John Landis's 1983 masterpiece, Trading Places. Um, so, for a fan of the form, and particularly for fans of just unparalleled, comedic talents of Dan Aykroyd, Eddie Murphy, and Jamie Lee Curtis, this film isn't just a movie. It feels like a sacred text almost. It represents a high watermark for the kind of screwball comedy, a genre it both revitalized and subverted, all while launching, its stars into this stratosphere and just delivering laughs that are as sharp and effective today as they were 4 decades ago. Um, over 4 decades ago. It's a film of just impeccable construction and fearless performances, and just a heart as warm as it is mischievously cynical. Um, on its surface, Trading Places is a modern day fable structured around this cruel wager. This wager of $1. So these these wealthy Duke brothers, played by Ralph Bellamy and Donna Mesh, in roles that they were seemingly born to play. They are the epitome of these old money villainy types. They hold this they hold this philosophical debate on nature versus nurture. Is a man's station in life determined by his breeding or his environment? To settle their bet, for $1, they they orchestrate this monstrous social experiment. They would deliberately ruin this Harvard educated managing director, Lewis Winthorpe III, played by Dan Aykroyd, by framing him for theft and drug possession and this moral turpitude. And simultaneously they will pluck this street smart beggar and hustler Billy Ray Valentine, played by Eddie Murphy, straight from the gutter, and install him into Winthorpe's job and his home and just his entire life basically, and they want to observe the results and all this. So this premise is just a classic comic engine, but the film's genius really lies in its execution. Excuse me for just a second. I gotta get a drink real quick. My throat's killing me. Sorry about that, folks. But like I said, the premise here is just a classic comic engine. Director John Landis, which is operating at the peak of his powers post Animal House and the Blues Brothers, really orchestrates just the the chaos with just a sure hand. And the script by Timothy Harris and Herschel. I forget what that other guy's name is, Herschel something. Is it's but it's airtight. It has these easy jokes for these character driven humor and just story that just unfolds with the precision of a Swiss watch or something. The the film is beautifully scored by legendary Elmer Bernstein, who brilliantly uses excerpts from Mozart's the Marriage of Figaro. This opera, it's about clever servants outwitting their masters. um as this kind of recurring motif, and lending a very classical, weight to the proceedings. Um, and the story's first half is this brutal and just hilarious deconstruction of Lewis Winthorpe's life. And you watch Dan Aykroyd; he's this master of this comedic, decay, and uh, uh, unravel. It is just both painful and hilarious. His descent from ordering a Bloody Mary and to chugging like cheap vodka from a fish tank is a masterclass in just physical comedy and escalating desperation. And conversely to that, Eddie Murphy's ascent is a joy to behold. Billy Ray Valentine doesn't just accept this new role; he conquers it. Using his innate cunning to understand just the commodities that better than these blue bloods ever could. His iconic scene explaining the metaphorical pork belly market to the stupefied dukes is Eddie Murphy at is his most electrifying. He's charismatic, he's sharp, just utterly commanding here. And the film truly finds its soul when the two protagonists realize that they're pawns in the same game. And the scene where this suicidal Winthorpe is saved by Billy Ray and Ophelia, and the butler Coleman, is just the really the pivotal heart of the movie. It's here that the class war truly begins. Their plan to turn the tables on the Dukes by hijacking this secret USDA report on orange crops is just this kind of glorious sequence. It's like a high sequence set on a train. So we go from one movie on a train to another, not just a Jamie Lee Curtis movie to another Jamie Lee Curtis movie, but they both features these New Year's parties on a train, which you see a young Jim Belushi in that sequence as well, dressed up as the gorilla. And then we have like what's supposed to be a real gorilla that's on board the train as well, which is it's one of the most that ends up being one of the most satisfying payoffs in the entire film. But the final act, like I said, is set on New Year's Eve, is just this pure is I mean, it's just a pure cinematic catharsis, I guess. You know, the the chaos of just the trading pit, the frenzy of all these numbers on a board, and the Duke's spectacular ruin are just executed with um, thrilling clarity. And I'll be honest with you guys, like when it comes to stocks and all the stuff that it shows in that final scene, like I have no idea what's fucking going on, and I've seen this movie many times, and because I don't understand how stocks and all this stuff work, but I just feel like you know the only understanding I have of it is that um, Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd's characters know what they're doing in that moment to get their revenge on the Dukes, and that's all that matters to me. I don't have to understand stocks to know, that that the Dukes are getting their comeuppance here, because that comeuppance that they get is not just deserved. It's poetically just. They are destroyed by the very system that they believe that they control. And they're beaten at their own game by the nurture of street smarts and the nature of human decency and ingenuity just that they so arrogantly dismissed. Um, and the legacy of this movie is very profound and multifaceted. Commercially, it was a huge hit. It cemented Eddie Murphy's status as a box office titan following 48 Hours, and proving that Dan Aykroyd could carry a film outside of the Blues Brothers. And then in the next year after this movie was released, Aykroyd would go on to do Ghostbusters. But critically, Trading Places was hailed as a triumphant return of that sophisticated screwball comedy, which is a genre that had kind of lain dormant for a while. But its impact, extends far beyond entertainment. Astonishingly, Trading Places, um, it entered the realm of a public policy. Sorry, I didn't realize I had my mic out there. So there was guys, I apologize. There was probably a few minutes there where you couldn't hear me too well because my mic was out here. But anyway, so Trading Places kind of entered this realm of public policy. The film's plot hinged on the illegal act of insider trading, using a stolen government report to manipulate the orange juice futures market. And in 2010, during these congressional hearings on the Dodd-Frank Act, Senator Mariah Cantwell directly referenced this film to explain the dangers of unregulated commodities trading. And she argued for measures to prevent real life versions of the Duke brothers from exploiting the market. It's a rare feat, for a comedy to be used as a legitimate explanatory tool in the halls of Congress, which is, I think, is a testament just to the film's kind of sharp and accurate critique of unbridled greed. And culturally, it remains a staple, especially as an unconventional Christmas and New Year's Eve movie, or New Year's movie, whichever you want to call it. It just the whole snowy Philadelphia settings, holiday parties, and the themes of redemption and charity have really earned a permanent place on seasonal watch lists. Just the film also spawned a wonderful unofficial, sequel of sorts when Bellamy and Amesh, reprised the Duke brothers characters in Eddie Murphy's Coming to America in 1988. And Jamie Lee Curtis went from being a horror queen to a comedy queen, and perhaps no single career was more transformed by this movie than that of Jamie Lee Curtis. Because like I said, at the time, she was irrevocably known as the Scream Queen, the definitive final girl of the Halloween franchise and a host of these other horror films. And the studio Paramount, famously opposed her casting, believing that her horror roots was all wrong for this sophisticated comedy. But John Landis fought for her, and just his instinct was genius. As Ophelia, Jamie Lee Curtis didn't just shed her Scream Queen image, she incinerated it. She is the film's moral and emotional anchor, this savvy, kind-hearted prostitute with with this plan. Her performance is nuanced and hilarious, and just it's very grounded. She isn't a damsel in distress or a one-note joke. She's the smartest person in the room here. She sees the potential for profit in helping Winthorpe, but her compassion becomes genuine, and her chemistry with Dan Aykroyd is palpable and sweet, and it culminates in this now legendary scene, where she disrobes to reveal this perfectly sculpted body, a moment that is less about titillation and more about her character's breathtaking confidence and just the awestruck realization of Winthorpe's incredible luck in finding her. Um, and she just stole every scene that she was in, and walked away, with awards for her performance. Trading Places flung open the doors for a new career for her. Leading her, directly to an iconic role in A Fish Called Wanda. And just established her as a kind of versatile and powerful comedic force. She proved that an actress could be strong and sexual and funny and intelligent all at once, and it really breaking that mold that the industry had firmly placed around her. Um, but in conclusion, Trading Places endures endures because it is quite simply a perfect comedy. Its premise is brilliant, its script is flawless, its direction is confident, and its performances are legendary. Dan Aykroyd delivers a performance of just exquisite, comic collapse, and and just that, that and redemption, and Eddie Murphy, explodes off the screen, which the raw, once in a lifetime, once in a generation like talent that just announced the arrival of this new king of comedy. And Jamie Lee Curtis, again, redefined herself and stole our hearts here, and they are all supported by, this flawless ensemble, from the perfectly villainous Dukes to that beautifully dignified Denholm Elliott, who played the butler, Coleman. But beyond all the laughs, which are constant and intelligent here, the film has this biting, relevant soul. It is a scathing critique of class and privilege and just unearned wealth that feels as urgent today as it did in the Reagan era. It argues that our circumstances are often this kind of matter of luck, and that integrity, intelligence, and just compassion are not the sole domain of the elite. And it's a story of the underdog, or in this case these two underdogs, rising up to topple these arrogant masters of this particular universe, and just doing so with style and wit and just this well timed gorilla on a train. But for any fan of comedy, or of its stellar cast, or of cinema that is both so funny and just sharply intelligent. Trading Places isn't just a movie to watch; it's a movie to treasure. It is and will always remain comic gold, and one of the greatest films of everybody involves filmographies. So if you've never seen Trading Places, definitely highly suggest it. One of the best Dan Aykroyd movies, one of the best Eddie Murphy movies, one of the best Jamie Lee Curtis movies, and so forth. Uh, so definitely check it out. And speaking of Dan Aykroyd, so moving on to the next movie here, we're going to go now, like we did from Terror Train to Trading Places with Jamie Lee Curtis. Now we're going from Trading Places to another Dan Aykroyd movie. And in this movie, I talked about this is a sequel to a film that I talked about in the very first episode of the 500 movies in 2025, back on January 1st. And the original film in this franchise is one of my favorite films of all time. And while I can't say this about the sequel, I love this movie so much. And as a devoted fan of Ghostbusters who grew up staring at toy proton packs, quoting lines from the original movie, um, eagerly awaiting any new entry into the franchise or any type of merchandise that would be released. My relationship with Ghostbusters 2 from 1989 has been one of this kind of deepening appreciation over time. Um, excuse me. Upon its release, sorry, I thought I was going to sneeze there for a second, but upon its release, the film was met with kind of this widespread critical dismissal and just commercially underperforming compared to the monumental success of the original film. However, as someone who has revisited this film countless times, not just as entertainment, but as a just a cherished piece of just cultural and personal nostalgia. I mean, how can you not love that they use the NES Advantage to control the Statue of Liberty at the end of this movie? But I firmly believe that Ghostbusters 2 deserves far more credit than it has historically received. It's not merely a retread or weaker imitation of the original. Rather, it's kind of this bold, heartfelt, and thematically rich sequel that successfully expands that universe while retaining the heart and humor that made the first film so beloved. Um, Ghostbusters 2 was directed by Ivan Reitman. It was written by Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis. And it reunited all the original's core cast with Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, Harold Ramis, Sigourney Weaver, Rick Moranis, Ernie Hudson, Annie Potts. And this is set 5 years after the original film, and it finds our heroes disgraced and defunded, and after saving New York City 5 years ago, um, from Gozer, the Ghostbusters were just hit with countless lawsuits for the collateral damage and caused during that battle, and now they're banned from conducting these ghost busting activities and kind of forced into obscurity. So Ray, runs this occult bookstore, and he performs at children's parties with Winston, and Egon, he conducts these kind of emotion based experiments in this lab, and Peter's hosting this like cheesy TV talk show on parapsychology. But when Dana, played by Sigourney Weaver, encounters these strange phenomena, involving her young son Oscar, most notably, the baby stroller rolling on its own into traffic, the Ghostbusters are reluctantly drawn back together for this, and just their investigation leads them to this discovery of this mysterious river of this psychic like slime that's running beneath New York City, and it's a physical manifestation of just the city's accumulated negative emotions, just the anger and the hate towards one another, and different things, just is what has helped create this. And this slime becomes the catalyst for the resurgence of Vigo the Carpathian, which is this powerful 16th century sorcerer whose portrait at the Manhattan Museum of Art begins manipulating those around it, particularly the infatuated Janusz, played by Peter McNichol, who seeks to give Vigo this a new body to possess, which is baby Oscar. And the film crescendos, on New Year's Eve, as the slime rises, causing chaos throughout the city, with the mayor initially, ignoring their warnings and even having them institutionalized by, and because everybody was just thinking, the Ghostbusters are crazy, because they're just trying to find their way out of these lawsuits and all this stuff that was going on with them at the time. So, but the Ghostbusters, they got to rally, these people in New York with all this positive energy, and I think is what one of the most iconic and emotionally uplifting sequences in the entire film. They use all this positively charged slime to animate the Statue of Liberty, and they're controlling this Statue of Liberty with the NES Advantage like control pad with the big buttons and the joystick and all that. It's really awesome they have that in there and just and so they're just piloting the Statue of Liberty through the streets to combat Vigo's influence. And as the crowd is singing, I don't even know the name of the song, but it's like all acquaintances be forgot. That's which is a song that's sang quite a bit on about every year on New Year's Eve, going into the new year. As they're singing all this in unison, their collective joy, overpowers Vigo's dark magic, just allowing these Ghostbusters to triumph and be reinstated as heroes. Um, and while critics at the time dismissed Ghostbusters 2 as a rehash of the original, I would argue that it's a thematically mature evolution of the first film's core ideas. Um, where Ghostbusters, the original Ghostbusters, was this sharp, satirical horror comedy about bureaucracy and urban decay and just scientific skepticism. Ghostbusters 2 leans into emotional resonance and social commentary, asserting that the human spirit, both its light and its darkness, has tangible power. The concept of negative emotions, um, kind of come together into this malevolent force, beneath the city is not just a clever plot device. It's a metaphor for how, despair and apathy and anger can really poison, uh, you know, a, can poison a community. And just this whole theme is just particularly poignant in the context of late 1980s New York. A city that's still reeling from economic hardship and rising crime and just and social tension. The idea that love and joy and unity could literally combat supernatural evil feels both fantastical and deeply aspirational. um in this era where cynicism was becoming the kind of default mode, both in comedy and in culture, Ghostbusters 2, they dared to say that positivity could be a weapon here. It's a message that feels almost radical, today, and one that really deserves, recognition for it. Um, and another one of the most underrated strengths of Ghostbusters 2, is its deep character work. The film takes time to explore how our heroes have changed, or in some cases, have stagnated. Peter Venkman, who's once this roguish, charmer, is now floundering in this shallow TV role, clearly unfulfilled. And his reconnection with Dana, and their bond over, this baby Oscar, it really adds emotional weight to his arc, just grounding, his usual sarcasm in genuine growth. And excuse me, Bill Murray, he delivers this masterclass, of and just in comedic timing. But here he also shows, vulnerability, especially in these quieter moments with Oscar and Dana. Um, and then you have Egon's subplot, his experiments on emotional resonance. This gives Harold Ramis, a chance to kind of showcase Egon's intellectual curiosity and uh, hidden emotional depth. His deadpan just delivery, remains hilarious. The door is closed, the window is down. But there's this new layer of humanity in his obsession with just the science of feelings. And Ray, which is played with just the endearing sincerity by Dan Aykroyd, brings optimism and that childlike wonder to every scene. His emotional response when Vigo mocks the Ghostbusters is nothing more than a um, pathetic band of unlicensed freaks is genuinely moving. It's weirdly moving. It's clear how much their legacy means to Ray. He's the heart and soul of the Ghostbusters. Um, but then you have Rick Moranis, as again as the legendary Lewis Tully. He's just once again an absolute comedic standout. I love Rick Moranis. I love the character Lewis Tully so much. It's one of my favorite things about the Ghostbusters movies, and I'm so sad that he didn't reprise his role in either of the newer Ghostbusters movies that came out that had the original cast in it. But I mean, that's another thing for another time to talk about as why Rick Moranis got out of acting. But but in Ghostbusters 2, his dynamic with Janusz kind of they're both trapped in that kind of mental grasp from Vigo. It really creates some of the film's funniest, most bizarre moments. Peter McNichol as Janusz is a revelation. His manic kind of awkward devotion to Vigo is both hilarious and just strangely tragic. His performance is so committed, so over the top in just the best way, and that it just deserves to be remembered, among the greatest comic turns in 80s cinema. Um, Candace, she loves Ghostbusters too, and she's always talking about Peter McNichol's character Janusz, and just it really like was weird, like so that it had this new character join into the sequel, and I think a lot of people thought it was just gonna be like a throwaway character, but he ended up being one of the funniest parts of the entire movie. But then there's Sigourney Weaver. So Dana isn't just a damsel in distress. She's a mother that's fighting to protect her child in Ghostbusters 2. And she's a professional restoring these cultural artifacts, and just someone reclaiming an agency after a traumatic past. Her arc in this is one of resilience, and Sigourney Weaver, which I absolutely love Sigourney Weaver, especially as Ellen Ripley, greatest female character of all time from the Aliens franchise. And in this, she just brings a quiet strength to the role that really elevates the film. Um, but while Ghostbusters 2 didn't have the same groundbreaking visual impact as the first film, it still delivers these unforgettable set pieces. Just the Statue of Liberty sequence is nothing short of legendary. Not just for its ambition, but for that emotional payoff, and just seeing the torch of liberty lit again, marching through the streets of Manhattan as these crowds are like cheering and singing along and everything. It's one of the most triumphant, inspiring images in any comedy film. It captures the fantasy of cities uniting, of ordinary people, becoming heroes through sheer joy. And the special effects, which were overseen here by Industrial Light and Magic, were state of the art, for the time. The slime itself is a character, and it's creepy and sentient, just visually inventive. Whether it's crawling up the walls, oozing from these manholes, or attacking Dana in her apartment. Um, it's a constant, unsettling presence, and the climax inside the museum with the Ghostbusters, battling Vigo's illusions, the animated painting, and just the final, confrontation, is just a masterclass in practical and visual effects, working in harmony together. Um, but upon its release, Ghostbusters 2, like I said, was deemed this kind of commercial disappointment. It made $215 million globally compared to the original's $282 million. And critics largely panned it as more of the same, but less funny, whatever. The shift towards a warmer, more family friendly tone, um, for some reason alienated fans, of the first film's kind of sharper satire. But like yet over time, the film has really undergone um, this change in how people feel about it. Today Ghostbusters 2 is appreciated for what it is. It's a sincere, optimistic sequel that doubles down on the heart of the franchise. It's not trying to replicate the novelty of the original. It's building on that foundation. It's themes of emotional energy and urban unity and just the power of love really resonate more strongly now than ever. And in a world, increasingly divided, the message that positive human emotion can be a force for good feels not naive now for nowadays, but really very, very necessary. Very much so. But the film also just laid crucial groundwork for the franchise's future. It introduced the idea of intergenerational legacy. The importance of Oscar and Vigo's plan, and just this theme would be echoed powerfully in Ghostbusters Afterlife. The emotional stakes, the use of family, and the emphasis on passing the torch, all began here. And moreover, Ghostbusters 2 expanded the universe beyond ghosts and ectoplasm into deeper mythological territory. Vigo the Carpathian is one of the most memorable villains in the entire Ghostbusters series, not because he's scary, but because he's hate personified. He embodies the very force that the Ghostbusters are fighting against. That's nihilism and ego and just the desire to dominate. And in that sense, he's the perfect villain for a story about hope. Um, and just the film also left this lasting, pop culture, footprint. Just a lot of the music within Ghostbusters 2 remain as anthems for the 80s, and just the image of the Ghostbusters, piloting the Statue of Liberty is really just etched into cinematic history, as one of the most iconic things that come out of the 80s movies. And just for years the film has inspired toys, comics, video games, theme park attractions. It's proof that despite critical derision, audiences continue to engage with it. And to call Ghostbusters 2 a failure is to really misunderstand its entire purpose. It was never meant to be a carbon copy of the 1984 original film that was a phenomenon. Instead it's a rare sequel that dares to deepen the emotional core of its predecessor while expanding its mythology. And yes, it's less edgy. Yes, it's more sentimental, but that doesn't make it lesser than, it makes it different. And different doesn't mean bad. Um, and that goes back to what I was saying at the beginning of the show when I was talking about Stranger Things and the whole scene with Will coming out on the last episode. It's not just about him, coming out as gay. It's just talking about in general, like people that are different. And sometimes when you're different, people, it may be like, your sexuality or your style of clothing or what kind of music you like or whatever, um, being different doesn't mean it's a bad thing, it just shows that you're, you know, um, because it's okay to not be like everyone else. So, yeah, I think that that's a good kind of full circle thing to mention here, with Ghostbusters 2. But just kind of looking at it as not a lesser film than the original Ghostbusters, but it just makes it different. And different, like I said, different doesn't mean bad. And and as a fan, I see Ghostbusters 2 not as a decline, but as this kind of necessary evolution. It reminds us that heroism isn't just about catching ghosts. It's about believing in each other, and it's about community. It's about choosing hope over fear. And the world may have needed Ghostbusters, in 1984, but in 1989, we certainly today need Ghostbusters too. It's a film that says, even when we're broken or if we're being sued or forgotten or just buried beneath these layers of cynicism, we can rise again, together. And for that reason and so many more, I don't just defend Ghostbusters 2, I celebrate it. It's not just a worthy sequel, it's a heartfelt, intelligent, and just deeply human film that deserves a second look. Look at it from with a different perspective and a new appreciation and just a rightful place, in that world of these great genre sequels. So long live the Ghostbusters and long live Ghostbusters 2. But that now brings me to the last film that I'm going to be talking about here in the 500 movies of 2025. And again, before I get into this, just thank you guys so much. Thank you guys for watching, for listening to me, uh, just and supporting me in this journey of trying to accomplish this goal. And even when I doubted myself many times, I wasn't going to be able to do it. I'm so glad that I was able to accomplish this. And to be honest with you, I'll probably never try this again. I'll probably never try to watch this many movies in a single year again. But man, it was a hell of an experience. And let's end it with End of Days. So I thought this was a perfect way to end the 500 movies in 2025 because not only is it a New Year's movie, it has the name End of Days, which is we are on the last day of 2025, and it also features my favorite actor of all time, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And if you watch my whole all my other Arnold Schwarzenegger film reviews here on the channel this year, you'll definitely know like what a high appreciation I have for the man. This will actually be the 18th film that I've reviewed of Arnold Schwarzenegger just in this year alone. Um, so that I'm a lifelong fan of him. I've journeyed with him through the jungles of Predator, the war torn future of the Terminator films, and even the comedic heights of movies like Twins and Jingle All the Way. His filmography is just a tapestry of iconic heroes, quotable one-liners, just unparalleled, physicality. And but this movie is often lost in the discussion of all of his great films. And End of Days was dismissed, by many critics upon release, and I'm here to argue that it stands as one of his most ambitious, atmospheric, and ultimately rewarding films. It's a perfect fusion of Schwarzenegger's, established persona with a darker, more soulful narrative. Um, so End of Days is this genre blending spectacle that just mashes up the visceral action of a Schwarzenegger film with the kind of ominous dread of a religious horror film. And this was directed by Peter Hyams, who has worked with Arnold and on other projects as well. And this film is drenched in just this palpable, excuse me, the palpable like, rain slicked gothic atmosphere that just feels more like Seven than it does Commando. Um, excuse me for just a second. All right. Sorry about that. So, but anyway, the story here is this high concept thriller. It's perfectly tailored for that millennial anxiety of late 1999 because everybody, like in the real world, thought that all these computers were going to crash, everything was going to go down, the world was coming to an end in the year 2000. So this is a perfectly tailored is a perfectly tailored film for those people who had that real life anxiety, in 1999. And then Arnold here, stars as Jericho Kane, is just is a far cry from the indestructible super cops of his past films. In this, he's a broken man. He's this former NYPD detective running this private security firm. Is hollowed out by the tragic murders of his wife and daughter, which honestly kind of reminds me of Max Payne. Because I don't know if anybody's ever played the Max Payne video games, but like that, his like Jericho, the story of Jericho in this film, just based on the whole how his wife and his daughter had been killed, and that how that happens, it it makes me wonder if Max Payne kind of gained inspiration from this film in that aspect. But anyway, you know, Jericho in this, he's haunted, and suicidal, and just he's abandoned all faith, both in humanity and in God. And this initial character depth is crucial. It gives Arnold something raw and vulnerable to play, a foundation of pain that makes his eventual redemption arc so powerful. Um, the central conflict erupts when Satan himself, which is brilliantly played by this very suave Gabriel Byrne. But Satan arrives in New York City, possessing this body of this wealthy banker, and his goal is to find and impregnate this chosen woman named Christine, played by Robin Tunney, before the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve, thus birthing the Antichrist and unleashing hell on earth. And Jericho, through his duty as a protector, becomes the unlikely, faithless shield, standing beneath the ultimate evil and its goal. Um, so the film masterfully, builds its world. We're introduced to this secret, sect of the Vatican. It's led by this by a desperate Rod Steiger, trying to kill Christine to save the world, and this cabal of Satanists embedded in the highest positions of power, working to usher in the apocalypse. And the action is just brutal and just grounded for an Arnold film. There are no cartoonish shootouts. Instead, we get a vicious, close quarters knife fight in an elevator and a relentless assault on a fortified church. The horror elements are effectively gruesome, and from the crucifixion of a priest, to Satan's demonic transformations, and then you even see Arnold, crucified in this as well. So, just the heart of the film, however, is Jericho's journey. This isn't just about saving the world. It's about a man just rediscovering, a reason to live. His relationship with Christine, isn't romantic, but paternal. He failed to save his own daughter, and this is his chance at this kind of spiritual absolution. And the finale, which is set in a church, is Arnold at his most dramatically powerful. Um, discarding his shotgun, he falls to his knees and does the one thing he thought he'd never do again. He prays, and it's a moment of profound vulnerability for the character and the actor, leading to this climax that isn't about muscle, but just about ultimate sacrifice. And his final act is, he impales himself on the sword of Michael, in this statue of Michael with this sword. So he impales himself on that sword to expel Satan, and it is a tragic and just heroic end that gives his character a complete and emotionally resonant conclusion. Um, and upon its release, End of Days was largely met with a lot of critical disdain, and that's kind of an ongoing thing here. If you go back and watch a lot of my reviews of these movies, that was a pretty common thing amongst the movies that I talk about. But critics at the time, seemed unable to reconcile the film's serious horror tinged tone with their expectation of this typical, you know, Arnold movie. They called it overly serious, convoluted, too dark. What I think they missed was the intentionality of it all. This was Arnold at the tail end of the 90s, consciously evolving beyond that pure action hero and just attempting something with more, thematic weight. Um, Financially, it was a clear success. It grossed over $200 million worldwide, and it proved that there was an audience for this. Just this kind of darker, iteration of of what we would commonly know Arnold as in other movies, but its true legacy has just been cemented in the years since, as it has grown to this kind of bona fide cult classic, amongst fans. Um, for the faithful fans of Arnold Schwarzenegger, including myself, it's revered as one of his last great serious action roles before his venture into politics and his later return to acting with this more kind of self-aware comedic roles. um it in the days represents the peak of his dramatic efforts within the action genre. The film's aesthetic, that gritty neo noir look of a pre Rudy Giuliani, New York has just aged perfectly and beautifully, and it's given it this, timeless, almost comic book quality that feels really unique, in his filmography. Um, furthermore, End of Days has influenced just the tone of subsequent genre films. Its blend of, apocalyptic prophecy and action and horror, paved the way for later franchises like Constantine and Legion, which, similarly, explore this grittier, more grounded conflict between celestial forces. And Gabriel Byrne's portrayal of Satan as this charismatic corporate suited manipulator, a devil who offers your deepest desires rather than just manifesting with horns and a pitchfork or whatever, has really become this template, for modern interpretations of the character of Satan. So I find that to be very interesting. Um, but for Arnold's career, it remains this kind of very bold, um, just a very bold part of his filmography. It's the film where he traded "Hasta la vista, baby" for a ragged, heartfelt prayer, and where the hero's victory is measured not in bodies that are being stacked, but in a soul that's saved. Both Christine's and his own, and just after he sacrifices himself and he sees his wife. Um, and his daughter who that were murdered years before, you know um they're in the church. It kind of gives you that idea that his soul is saved and he's going to get to go to heaven and get to see his family again. And I just find that incredibly beautiful. I love the ending of this film. But in conclusion, End of Days is not a perfect film. But few are. There are a few movies that are perfect, but it's a fiercely ambitious, exceptionally crafted, and just dramatically rich one that deserves far more credit than it initially received. It showcases a side of Arnold Schwarzenegger that we rarely got to see. Not the flawless, killing machine, but this broken man who's riddled with guilt and doubt, and who finds his purpose, through a selfless act of faith. Um, it's a film that respects its audience's intelligence, plunging them into this world of moral ambiguity and just spiritual warfare, without offering any kind of easy answers. It's bolstered by a genuinely terrifying villain, a compelling arc for its hero, and just some of the most consistently gripping and well shot action sequences of Arnold's entire career. For any fan who believes Schwarzenegger is more than just a one liner machine, End of Days is essential viewing. If you've never seen this film, if and you're an Arnold fan, this will change how you look at him very drastically. It's a testament of a star, refusing to be typecast, pushing his iconic persona into the darkness and just emerging with, I think, with one of his most memorable and human performances in his entire career. So, End of Days remains a hellishly good time for me, and this whole journey through these 500 movies in 2025, and just having this YouTube channel to share my thoughts and feelings on these movies, and it's just really been a hellishly good time as well. And it's I can't believe it's already over. It just feels like that this entire year has zoomed by, and I can't believe that I'm actually saying that I watched 500 movies in 1 year. Um, and I said I would mention this at the end of the show. As far as the future of the channel goes, well, if there's one thing for sure with Crater, that's nothing's for sure. Um, so what I mean by this is, am I be going away from the channel? No, no, not exactly. But I won't frequently be on here as I was throughout this entire year, because I've got close to 100 videos that I've done just in this year alone, here on the channel, and this was my very first year of having the YouTube channel. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'm still going to be present here on the channel. I'm still going to be doing videos, not as many, frequently. And I don't really know right now, like, what, kind of content I'm going to put out there. I mean, it's going to just kind of be up in the air. But I know that, um, I'm probably not going to be doing as many movie reviews, if I do any more at all. But if that's something you guys would like to see, if you'd like to see me review more movies here on the channel, let me know. If there's other things you want to see me do, like collection videos or talk about wrestling, or just video games, whatever. Like, I would love to hear your guys' input. What kind of content you would like to see here on the channel going forward. Um, but yeah, just ultimately right now, I'm gonna take some time for maybe about a month or so. I'm starting a new job here very soon. In a new town away from Hazard. So, and that may, depending on how that goes, we may end up moving there altogether. So there's a lot of different things I got to focus on here coming up in my actual life. But I will assure you guys that I will be back at some point in the next year, um, doing videos, different, other than just movie reviews, but just a lot of different stuff. I really like to do some collection videos. I like to show you guys a lot, because I did that a little bit in some of my movie review videos this year, like the Universal Monsters videos I did earlier in the year. I showed you guys several pieces of my Universal Monsters collection in those videos. So I would like to do some more of that kind of stuff going forward in the next year. But yeah, just kind of keep a lookout. And it's always best, to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, that whole spiel. I really appreciate you guys more than you even possibly know, for even coming here and listen to me when nobody forced you to do it. No one put a gun in your head and said, "Hey, go watch Crater's videos on the Crater Mania YouTube channel." You guys did that, yourselves, and just thank you guys so much for just taking the time to watch these videos, or if you shared it with other people. I appreciate you guys so much. I just want to thank a few people too that's kind of supported me on this journey. First and foremost, I want to talk about my number one supporter for anything I do, and that's my wife Candace. And I mean, she really is the one that's helped me motivate me so much by just doing this and everything else that I do in life. I don't know where I'd be without her. So I just want to thank her, for really just supporting me so much and motivating me to accomplish this goal. Also, my son Noah, just thank him so for and he was when he first heard that I was gonna have a YouTube channel, he was ecstatic because my son, he loves YouTube. He's part of that whole, younger generation's culture. It's obsessed with YouTube and everything now. And he's like, "Dad, you're gonna be a YouTuber." And it's like that's and just to see his enthusiasm over that is just it really means a lot to me. And then, I'd also like to thank um, you know, my mother-in-law, my mom and dad, and just everybody in my family who has kind of helped support me in this journey as well, and kind of uh, you know, and just kind of give me that support that what I need to do to move forward, and just in life in general. And then I also want to thank some friends like Wes and Aaron over at Dead Pit Radio, Dana, Evil Dead Chick on YouTube, just so many people out there, so many of my friends from work and just friends on Facebook. Thank all you guys for just kind of being there behind me, supporting me, sharing my stuff. It really means a lot. And as I always do, please drop me a comment below on this video of what your favorite of the movies I talked about tonight, or if you have another movie that's New Year's based. Let's talk about that as well. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that, guys. That would mean a lot to me. And, if you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button below to catch more videos coming up in the year 2026. And as always, click that bell for any future notifications. But with all that said, guys, I'm Crater. This is Crater Mania. I love you guys. Have a good night and have a happy new year.